I started working out at 14 years old. I was just skinny and I felt inadequate. And I was in junior high school and I wanted to gain weight. And I didn't know that you could gain muscle to gain weight. I thought that you could only eat a lot of food and gain a lot of weight, which was obviously would have been fat. But I had a very fast metabolism, and so that wasn't going to work either. So I just found my way to Bill Pearl's gym, which was the local gym, and made a deal there where I started scrubbing floors in exchange for membership. Bill Pearl is a legend in bodybuilding. He's a four-time Mr. Universe winner. He won his fourth Mr. Universe at the age of 41. He happened to own the gym in Pasadena, which is where I was living, 5 blocks from where I was living. I was just super lucky, and I went there, and I didn't know who he was. I didn't know he was a champion. I just knew he was a local gym owner. And I made a deal with him, started scrubbing showers in exchange for membership, and at the age of 14, 15 years old. And then later, I realized that this guy, my mentor, was a 4-time Mr. Universe winner. I'm gonna stand right here, pretty much the place where I have that picture taken with Bill Pearl when I was 16 years old. And the picture was taken by a photographer for New West magazine. It was for an article about California's new child play, teenage bodybuilding. And Bill Pearl was my mentor, and I was obviously in very good hands. So this building, wow, this is where it all began. This is where I was 15 years old, and I walked up to Bill Pearl and I said, Mr. Pearl, I'd like to work out here, but I can't afford it, and I'd like to work for you. I'd like to do janitorial work or anything you'd like me to do in order so I can earn my membership, my ability to train here. And Bill said yes. Bill said, come on in here every Saturday and you can scrub my showers for me, and you'll earn your week's membership in advance. Right here, this building. You know, my mother raised me. My father left when I was 5. And so I didn't really know what I wanted to do career-wise. And I was in love with bodybuilding. And I had Bill Pearl as my example of what you could do in business. And so I thought, you know, I'm just gonna open up a gym. I'm standing in front of the building that used to be Brignoli Fitness, my gym, in Pasadena. And I'm standing across the street in the parking structure, probably on the 2nd floor, maybe 3rd floor, so I can kind of see the roof, and I'm looking down at it. And the front looks pretty much the same as it did. It's got the same structure. The windows look a little different, but it looks kind of the same. I opened it when I was 24 years old. I was dating a girl whose father was an entrepreneur, and so he kind of took me by the hand and taught me how to do a business plan, and I was up and running at the age of 24, and I ran the gym for a total of 11 years at this location for 8 years, and then at another location for another 3, a bigger location. We were able to expand it, but you know, it was a significant time in my life. It was significant for a lot of reasons. I won Mr. America and Mr. Universe training here at my gym. It was the beginning of the fitness industry boom. So personal training didn't even exist when I opened this in 1984. And it started to emerge as a business, as an industry, right around 1986, 87-ish. But the memories are fond. I'm glad I've moved past that, because I don't think gym ownership is where I'd like to be today, but I think it was a critically important time in my life for establishing my knowledge of the industry and my identity within the industry. There were a lot of fun memories and a lot of fun times. One time, Sean Ray, and many people know Sean Ray, he's very well known in not only in the bodybuilding world, but just even in the sports world. Fantastic bodybuilder, fantastic personality. He was producing a video called Lifestyles of the Fit and Famous. And I guess he decided to include me in that Fit and Famous group. And he came here and with his camera crew, and he walked through the door, and of course I was surprised to see him. It was an anniversary party we were having. So that's why when you see this footage, you'll see that, you know, it's festive. It's not what you'd expect to see in a day-to-day gym. But, you know, it was great and an honor to have him come and visit us and to include us in the production. And then we went in the back and did some dancing.
Well, we've got a DJ playing simultaneously in the aerobic room. 5-piece band is playing here in the weight room. We've got our no-host bar here. We've got it fully catered by a company called Castle Catering, doing a fabulous job. We've got the USC Trojan Marching Band doing the opening number for us. We've got about 1,000 guests. We're having a great time.
The home of where a lot of things happened, including when I won my division in Mr. America and in Mr. Universe. Michael Jordan came to work out here. Right there in front, I stood there with Dave Draper. That's a historic picture. Down here a little bit, I stood with Boyer Coe. So I had some pretty famous people coming and visit. At my grand opening, Chris Dickerson was here and Jim Morris was here. It was a wonderful time. The 80s, the 80s, and I guess you could say I became significantly more well-known in the industry in the time that I had this gym, Brignoli Fitness. When I owned my gym, it was 1984. That's when I opened it, and so that was kind of the beginning of the fitness boom. And from a business standpoint, that was a good time to open up a gym. But it was obvious to me that there was just a lot of false information out there, a lot of marketing, and a lot of magazines, and people pretending that this was the workout or that was the workout. But I knew what the workout really was, and I thought this is just fluff. This is just what readers, I guess, want to see. But it was obvious to me that there was a lot of dishonesty in the industry. You know, I did really well in the first 8 years of having my gym. And then LA Fitness, Family Fitness, these chain gyms started coming into the market, and the boutique type gyms like I had were just really struggling to compete against these bigger companies. And ultimately I was forced out of the business. But the thing that I learned was that fitness was becoming very, very commercial. That it was not about information and honesty, it was about masses. And the more that you can sell glitz to the masses, the more the industry was going to move in that direction. One of the things I discovered was that fitness consumers are very naive. They'll buy anything. And as a result of that, you know, these marketers will basically sell them anything. And I noticed that everything from equipment being not well made, meaning not correctly made, and a lot of, you know, bogus nutrition supplements, gear, straps, balls, balance things. It was going crazy. I could just see that the industry was just becoming so commercialized that I even ended up having to get out of the business. I thought, this is not even a business I want to be in it anymore. I started doing personal training for about 10 years, and about 10 years after doing that, I just decided to change industries. I ended up moving for 2 years to Nicaragua and exporting mahogany, because I thought, you know, this is not an industry I want to be a part of anymore. When I moved to Nicaragua and took this job exporting mahogany, I was open to anything. I was ready for any business. But what I discovered was that time away from the industry allowed me to sort of clear my head and realize that there were opportunities that were not really being utilized, taken advantage of. Namely, the selling of truth, the selling of real, honest information, the selling of science, rather than just, you know, fluff. And so after 2 years of, well, learning all about lumber and learning about import-export and learning about, you know, doing business in a third world country, what I really wanted to do was come back and pursue fitness again, but from a truth perspective. So when I came back, I started training again and thought I would compete again, and Ironman magazine wanted to do an article about Doug Brignoli back in the game. So one of the things I mentioned in that interview was this book that I wanted to write, that I wanted to call Stop the Overhead Presses. Somebody wrote to John Balick, the publisher of Ironman magazine, and said, you know, Doug Brignoli is wrong about overhead presses. And so I thought, well, I'll just write an expose. And so I wrote this article called The Case Against Overhead Presses, and I gave it to John Balick. And I launched a writing career. John Balick loved it so much, he wanted to put it in the magazine, and I became a regular writer for Ironman magazine. After writing articles for Ironman magazine and getting the feedback from people that I was getting, I realized that the information that I was providing was actually very valuable and very unconventional. People had not yet heard this information before. And so I thought, well, I should probably write a good book, a good volume that explains all the different aspects about resistance exercise, the physics aspect of it, and the neurological and the physiological and the anatomical, all the things that I had learned that were actually more correct than the things that we had been taught. One of the things I learned along the way was that there was an obsession with how much weight people could lift. And it was obvious to me that now that I had done a lot of bodybuilding and had won some respectable titles, And I never cared about how much I could squat or how much I could bench press. And so I could see that these were different goals. The goal of lifting as much as possible was a different goal, and yet people were blending these goals together. So I discovered there was just a lot of things that didn't make sense, a lot of things that were illogical in terms of dogma and beliefs in the fitness industry. And I thought, you know what, I would love to be able to clear this stuff up, but frankly, it's like a religion. There's a lot of people that are so emotionally attached to this stuff that it's literally hard for them to believe otherwise. You know, I started to realize that directions of anatomical motion mattered a lot. Directions of resistance mattered a lot. And I started to discover things like, well, I'll throw this out, resistance curve, right? For example, I was doing wrist curls on a bench and I realized that it was too heavy at the bottom and too light at the top. And when I cranked up the rear end of the bench and I angled my forearms down, I lightened up the bottom and increased the top. That's physics, right? So that's the kind of thing that you realize you can manipulate when you're weight training, and you can improve an exercise just by changing angles and improving the resistance curve. Well, you know, it was a discovery process. So in other words, I was curious about something, I look into it, and as I'm looking into that thing, I find these other things. So, like, I'll give you an example. If I'm doing a curl simultaneously with two 30-pound dumbbells, it's harder than if I do one at a time. Why is that? So you Google it, right? And you find this thing called bilateral deficit. And in the process, you find other neurological things that are talked about in those same books or in those same articles. And you discover reciprocal innervation, active and passive insufficiency. You discover these things that actually present conflicts during certain exercises precisely for the muscle you're trying to target. And you realize this, doesn't anybody realize this? Doesn't anybody know this? Why are we ignoring this? Here's a couple of other examples. When you do a rowing exercise, like a one-arm dumbbell rowing exercise, you may be ignoring the fact that you're feeling it more in the rear deltoid than anywhere else, because you're told it's a lat exercise. And the lat does work, but you can't ignore the fact that the rear deltoid is really aching, right? So my mind started going to sort of like physics. And I thought, well, if the Leaning Tower of Pisa is falling north, and it's my job to keep it from falling, where am I gonna stand? I'm gonna stand on the south side of the tower, not the east side or the west side. In other words, the load is going to be directly opposite the force, right? So if I'm pulling in this direction, whatever is opposite this is gonna be my rear deltoid. It can't be my lat, right? So then you realize that there's a better way. The better direction of resistance is the one that comes laterally for the lats, right? In other words, you have to move toward the spine, because that's the rope that's holding the Leaning Tower of Pisa. So opposite position loading is one of the factors that determines the efficiency of an exercise. So here's the thing is, there's a thing called opposite position loading, or it could also be called the line of force. So the resistance is going in a 12 o'clock direction. Whatever's at the 6 o'clock direction, opposite the forward pull, will be most loaded, and that's going to be his rear deltoids and also his lower back. If you're trying to get the trapezius or the lats, and the origins of those muscles are on the spine, then this resistance will have to go around the corner. So you're better off getting a resistance that goes this way and this way for either the lats or for the middle trapezius. But having a forward direction of resistance is the wrong, or less than ideal, direction of resistance if you're trying to target the back muscles. Another one is the direction of anatomical motion, right? So, you know, we've all been told that incline presses are for the upper chest. But logically, if I give you a rope and I tie that rope to another heavy object and I say pull on that rope, that heavy object is gonna move toward you and only toward you. That means the highest muscle on my chest is gonna pull my arm in a flat bench direction. So now what we're gonna look at is an incline barbell press. There's two problems with this. Number one is he's moving his arms in a direction that is above the shoulder line. There are no pectoral fibers above the shoulder line. So he's moving his arms in a direction more toward his neck. Like if I were to get over this, he's not actually over the beefier part of his chest. That's problem number one. Problem number two is because he's got a barbell and not dumbbells, he can't pull his arms to the midline of the body, which is what the pectoral muscles want to do. They want to come in, so this is the wrong angle and limited range of motion. So now we're doing a decline dumbbell press. And what you'll notice here is that he's moving his arms now toward the middle of his sternum. He's moving the insertion of his pectoral muscle right to the area of his chest where the greatest number of pectoral fibers are located. Before, he was moving it up toward his chin or his neck, right? There's no fibers there. He's also pulling inward now toward the midline rather than pushing linearly out to the sides. This is the advantage of dumbbells and the advantage of a decline press. Much better for the pectoral muscles than an incline barbell press. So why am I moving toward my chin? In other words, all the pectoral fibers are below my arm line. None are above the arm line. So that is an improper, less than ideal direction of anatomical motion. So that is a factor. And then I discovered 16 total factors. Direction of anatomical motion, direction of resistance, early phase loading, these neurological things I was talking about. All of this stuff was just news to the industry. Why? It's all in the books. It's all either in a physics book or a neurology book. It's all there. It's all been researched. It just hadn't been presented to the bodybuilding or the muscle building or the sports training market. In regard to incline presses, it's very common for someone to just really arch their back when they're doing the incline. And if you actually look at their torso, it's actually a flat bench on the upper half and an incline on the lower half. And so they're actually getting into the position of a flat bench, and they're so convinced by what they've seen from Arnold Schwarzenegger's book and everything else that they're feeling it in the upper pecs, and maybe they are, but they aren't feeling it anymore in the upper pecs than they would be if they were doing a flat press. They're just convinced that it's, but let me ask you this question. How many times have you seen someone get off of an incline bench, check their upper chest pump low? Who checks their upper chest pump like this? No one, right? Everyone checks their pump here, right? That's where you feel the upper chest contract. Why isn't that an indicator? Where does everyone check their rear deltoid pump? Here. Why doesn't rear deltoid end there? Why does it end there? Who checks their rear deltoid there? Right? Where does the trapezius contract? I mean, not the triceps. Where does the tricep contract? Down. Who checks their tricep contraction like this? Right? You want to make sure that the exercises are ending where that muscle contracts. That is the ideal anatomical motion. So what he's doing here, we know it as a skull crusher. It's a supine dumbbell tricep extension. And what makes this a good exercise is the fact that right there, his forearm gets horizontal, perpendicular to gravity. Whenever a lever, a limb, is perpendicular to gravity, it has the biggest moment arm, distance between the pivot and the weight, it loads the muscle the most. And you'll notice that that happens when his arm is at 90 degrees, his elbow is at 90 degrees, and that's when the tricep is elongated. When he extends up, the muscle shortens, loses strength, and the resistance diminishes. So this is called early phase loading. It's loading the tricep in the early part of the range of motion and diminishing the resistance toward the end of the range of motion, and that's ideal. So now we're going to evaluate the parallel bar dips as a tricep exercise, and you'll notice that the forearm is mostly parallel with gravity. It's mostly vertical. That means the moment arm is just that wide right there. You're getting a bigger moment arm here, but this bone is being operated by the front deltoid and a little bit by the chest, not by the tricep. So as a tricep exercise, this is much inferior to that skull crusher we just showed you. We've all been told that compound exercises are king. And you know, since I got into bodybuilding at 15, 16 years old, I was hearing that. But you know, I was experimenting with compound exercises and isolation exercises, and it got me to thinking. When there's three muscles involved, like in a squat, for example, the quadriceps, the glutes, the lower back, the erector spinae, the question everyone should be asking is, are each of these muscles doing the best they can do, getting the most they can get, as compared to how they would be participating in an isolation exercise? They can't possibly be benefiting by the other one working simultaneously, right? They're doing their job, and that's all they know about. So the question is, how do we evaluate that? Well, you evaluate that using physics, you evaluate that using neurology, and using anatomical directions of motion. So the squat is a complicated thing to explain in short, but let me just say that the lower leg is the operating lever of the quadricep, and because of its barely 30-degree angle, it only gives the quadricep about 30% of the load that you're using on your back. And so since you can sense that you can use more weight, you put more weight on your spine, further compress your spine to compensate for the fact that you're using an inefficient lower leg lever instead of fixing that lower leg lever angle. Okay, so there's a thing there. When you're doing a compound movement and you're, let's say, hitting the glutes, hip extension, and quads, knee extension, each of those two muscle functions would benefit more by a different direction of resistance. But because it's one exercise, you have one direction of resistance, and so they both get compromised. If you change the angle of the lower leg, you diminish the glutes. If you change the angle for the glutes, you diminish the quadricep, right? So right away, we're talking about the amount of weight that you can lift is more because of these diminished loads on each participating muscle. So you think that you can load these muscles more because you're using more weight, when in fact, it's because of these diminished lever angles that you are forced to use more weight in order to compensate for these physics shortcomings. In other words, people think that if they do a sissy squat or something else that forces them to use a lighter weight, they assume the muscle is loaded less, when in fact, it's loaded with a bigger percentage of the weight you're using. And that's what we should be focusing on, is the amount of load a muscle gets, not on the amount of weight you're actually lifting. And then there's a couple of neurological things too. There's a thing called reciprocal innervation, which basically tells an opposing muscle to shut off. If you're doing curls, the tricep is shutting off. When you're doing squats, the glutes are firing and loaded. The hip flexors are disconnected by the central nervous system. One of those hip flexors is part of your quadricep, the rectus femoris. So here you are trying to build your quadriceps without knowing that 20%, 25% of your quadricep has been deactivated because you're trying to do two things at one time. So the last point on this is that people lean forward when they do a squat. They pretty much have to keep their balance. If you look at someone from the side and you realize that their torso is leaning farther forward than their lower leg is, and their torso is longer than their lower leg is, that means the magnification that their lower back is getting is significantly more than the load their quadricep is getting. So for all of these reasons, the idea that you're gonna favor a squat because it's a compound movement, not realizing there's neurological issues, there are physics issues, and then there's these, weaker links that are being compromised. In other words, that you could be injuring your spine. It is just foolish. You're better off looking at each individual joint function and muscle function and maximizing those if your objective is to have a totally strong body and a totally developed body. Human nature is funny. Sometimes people don't want to know the truth, right? It's the old, you can't handle the truth. People want to believe they're Herculean. People want to believe that they're beasts in beast mode. And they would prefer to have the exhibition type of lifting where they're surrounded by people who are cheering them on because they're squatting 405 or 495 or 515 or whatever they're squatting, because it feels more ego gratifying. It takes someone with less ego, more intelligence, more logic, less emotion to understand that you're actually working harder than you need to, that you can get more benefit with less cost. And this is the thing, this is the barrier. It's an emotional barrier that people have to overcome. Once you get past that, once you get past the dogma and the groupthink, and you can start focusing on what is truly sensible, truly logical, truly scientifically sound, you can actually get better results with less effort and less risk of injury if you just allow yourself to understand it. What I'm talking about here is biomechanics. And biomechanics is a combination of biology, and mechanics, which is physics, right? So some people don't understand that. Some people think that biomechanics is only physics, that it's just math. It is math, right? So there are math components, but they have to blend with physiological components. So for example, let's just say that everyone knows that a lever, a pendulum that's hanging vertically, is parallel to gravity. It's neutral, right? If you're holding a pendulum, it'll stay there without any effort, right? If it's over the pivot, you can balance it on your hand practically, right? Once it gets horizontal, it's harder and harder to hold. It takes more force, right? The same is true with our limbs, right? When a limb is perpendicular to the direction of resistance, whether it's free weight gravity or a cable or a cam, as would be the case in a leg extension machine or something like that, then that muscle is the most loaded it can be. If you only look at it from that perspective and you don't consider the biological component, then you'll miss it. In other words, this is why we don't let structural engineers or physics professors evaluate exercises for us, right? If you're doing a flat dumbbell press, you know that as this lever swings out, it loads the pecs more. As they swing up, it loads the pecs less. That's good because the resistance curve of that movement matches the strength curve of the muscle. We're stronger when the muscles are elongated and weaker when the muscles get contracted. So this is an example of how you blend these two things, physiological, anatomical things with physics-related things. So here's the thing, is not only are there ways to make resistance exercise more productive, there are ways of doing resistance exercise that have a high degree of injury risk. One example of this is the preacher curl. So here now we're looking at a preacher dumbbell curl. And what you're noticing here is, in fact, I'm gonna relieve him just a little bit. In this position right here, his bicep is pulling on his forearm almost parallel to his bone. And at the same time, he has a significant angle of his forearm relative to the direction of gravity. That's two magnifiers happening at the same time. That could rupture this bicep tendon if this weight was heavy enough. Now, as he pulls back up again, his forearm ends up vertical, which means neutral. It's a neutral lever. The bicep has no load at the top. So you would have to ask yourself, why would I do an exercise that gives me too much load at the bottom, zero load at the top, if you're not gonna be able to change the shape of your bicep, and you can't, right? This is nothing but compromise. No advantage whatsoever. Okay, so now we're gonna do just a standard alternating dumbbell curl. Now you might think this is an inferior exercise just because it's so common. You might think the more obscure exercises like a preacher dumbbell curl might be more beneficial, but that's not true. This matches the mechanics of the arm to the physics of the weight perfectly. You can see that when he's at the bottom, his forearm is parallel to gravity, it's vertical, but he's got the mechanical disadvantage, so he's got a magnifier there anyway. Then as his forearm gets horizontal, halfway through the range of motion, his bicep is able to pull perpendicularly on that forearm, working from a mechanical advantage. So the weight is heavier where he's stronger, and it's lighter where he's weaker. This is perfect. He's doing it alternate in order to avoid this thing called bilateral deficit, which happens when you do both arms at the same time. This is an exercise that has the least compromises for the bicep. This makes it great. If you put your arm on a tabletop and it's heavy enough and you let that forearm get horizontal, perpendicular to gravity, and you're pulling from a mechanical disadvantage, and the weight is heavy enough, you will snap your bicep. Trainers need to know this. It's irresponsible if a trainer doesn't know where those risks are because they're provable. They're out there, right? So this is something I care about. I want to prevent injury. Yes, you could try to make the argument that maybe if you continue doing the preacher curl, you're gonna make that tendon stronger, you're gonna make that joint stronger, you're gonna build the resilience to that. Well, first of all, yes, bones and tendons do get stronger over time, not at the same rate as muscles do, but there's no advantage to those exercises. In other words, you're not gonna improve muscle development more by exposing your injury, your joint to the injury risk, right? So it's not a smart investment, right? So the wise thing to do is to look at every particular person. If you're training for tennis, if you're training for shot put, if you're training for football, all of these sports have their unique needs, and you can supplement those needs with sport-specific training, but the actual muscle building can really be narrowed down to just a few exercises for each muscle group. That would be the best way to strengthen and develop each particular muscle of our body. Part of biomechanics includes the subject of anatomy, specifically musculoskeletal anatomy, muscles and skeleton, right? So we need to know what the joints naturally do, most naturally do, and we need to know which directions muscles pull their respective limbs, right? So if you don't know anatomy, or you haven't been introduced to the basics of anatomy, then you don't know what the right direction of anatomical motion is, what safe joint motion is. So this is an important aspect of biomechanics. One of my endorsers for the book is a paleoanthropologist, and we've had these long conversations about the evolution of the human anatomy. And so People like Robert Eckhart, they're basically forensic scientists who look at the skeleton and they can tell by the way it's shaped and designed what those joints were designed to do. That doesn't mean that we can't do other things that we're not necessarily in our evolutionary need. Like I can curl behind my back if I need to, right? But that's not as normal a need through evolutionary history as just picking things up in functional, necessary ways. So it's important to mimic our evolutionary musculoskeletal design so that it matches the exercises we're doing. Now, if you're a pitcher and you've got to do something that is specific to your sport, now you don't have to be so precise in matching skeletal design. But if you're doing fitness and you're doing bodybuilding and your objective is to be pain-free, as developed as you can possibly be, as healthy as you can possibly be, there's no reason why you should be doing motions that are not fully natural. Look, you know, if you're a logical, sensible person, you should be asking the question, what does a muscle do best? What does my pectoral muscle do best? What does my tricep do best? What does my side deltoid do best? If you're curious, as I was, when you just look around the gym and you see all these people doing all these different exercises, you should be asking the question, how are these different? Is one better than the other? Does it change the shape of the muscle? Are they all necessary? Once you whittle it down, you realize that most muscles, certainly every single muscle fiber, does one thing, and one thing only. It pulls the insertion towards the origin. That's what it does. And it does it more forcefully when that insertion is farther away, and it does it less forcefully when the insertion is closer. That's the muscle strength curve. So when you whittle all these things down, you find that there is such a thing as one or two best exercises for each muscle. You don't need all these supplemental muscles because that muscle does one thing best. The next thing it does, second best. The next thing it does, third best, fourth best. Why would you do first, second, third, and fourth best instead of just doing more of the first best? Logically speaking, right? This whole idea that you can work inner bicep, outer bicep, upper quad, lower quad, inner thigh, outer thigh, inner calf, outer calf. Logically, it doesn't make sense. These aren't separate tendons. You don't have one tendon for the outer calf and one for the inner calf. They converge on the Achilles tendon. They do one thing. The 4 quadricep heads converge on one quadricep tendon, patella tendon. The knee is a hinge joint. It does one thing, right? You can narrow it down logically to these things. And then what ends up happening is you say, okay, well, what about changing it up? Don't I need variety? And you say, well, it doesn't make any sense that you would switch up something that's great for something that's compromised. That would be like saying, I want to get a suntan, I'm in UV light, I want to switch things up, I'm going to try incandescent light. I'm going to try fluorescent light. I'm going to try neon light. Yes, they're different, but they're not as good as UV light. You're better off just taking a break and going back to UV light. If you feel burnt out or you want a refresher of some sort, it just doesn't make sense. Once you understand that exercises are not all equal, right? They're different degrees of good, less good, less good, less good, less good. And once you understand that you can narrow it down, if you want to do a variety of exercises, then you understand that you're trading off value, that's okay, but at least you know it. When you narrow it down, it ends up being 1 or 2 exercises for each muscle group. And if you want to just be streamlined, if you want to be maximally efficient, then you do the 1 or 2 best exercises and you forego the ones that are compromised. Now, as I said, if you want to do stuff for fun, for variety's sake, and you know that those other exercises are compromised or have a higher injury risk or have a higher energy cost, then go ahead and do those. But it's important for you to not delude yourself into thinking that you're gonna get the best result possible with an exercise that only rates, let's say, 3 or 4 on a scale of 1 to 10, right? So it boils down to about 20 exercises. There are some substitutes, of course, but I call them the Brig 20, but they're 20 exercises. They're not magical, they're just the least compromised. They're the most efficient exercises of all the options that are out there. Look, if the superstars from the 80s and 90s had known about these training methods back then, and they were using them, I honestly cannot tell you that they would be bigger, more developed than they ended up being. That's not what this is about. It's about efficiency. It's about finding a way to get the same results, maybe better, but certainly with less wear and tear and less wasted effort. Look, you know, I'm 61 years old right now, and I'm still training fairly hard, which is fairly remarkable for someone who's been doing it for 43 years. There are other people that are all beaten up. They've had shoulder replacements, spinal fusions, hip replacements, knee replacements, and they would tell you that it was worth the price. They would tell you it's the price you have to pay. That's what they believe, right? But they don't understand that muscle load doesn't rely exclusively on how much weight you're lifting. You can get that much muscle load or even more using less weight with smarter exercise mechanics, right? So logically speaking, you can get just as big, just as developed using these methods, even though it's easier on your body and saves a lot of wasted effort. So one of the misunderstandings is this idea that when you do a squat or a compound movement, that you're going to get more testosterone production. And it is true that you get a little bit of growth hormone and testosterone increase when you do these really heavy, exhausting compound exercises. And the reason for that is because the energy crisis that is sometimes created with that exercise, with that weight, with that intensity, results in systemic stress and cortisol production, which is a catabolic. So in order to compensate for the catabolic, the body produces a little bit of anabolic, but it's very short-lived and it's a very small amount. And now they've done some studies. This is corroborated by Brad Schoenfeld, exercise physiologist, who explains that they've done a longitudinal study and have discovered that those did not produce long-term anabolic effects. It's very short-lived. When we're talking about resistance exercise, we're talking about biomechanics and physiology. Now, as I said, physiology includes some things like, early phase loading, a muscle strength curve and things like that, but it also includes some things like high reps versus low reps, frequency of workouts, rest time between sets, etc. When Mike Mentzer was promoting his heavy duty training, he was promoting super high intensity, low sets, usually just 1 or 2 sets, all out, including breakdown sets, right? So you would just strip the weight off and keep going and going and going. This is physiology. This is not biomechanics. This is not anatomical. This is not physics. This is just sheer intensity. There are other people in the industry that can address intensity issues a little better than I can. I'm not gonna try to be the exercise physiologist here. But it is safe to say that there have been a lot of studies now that have shown that that kind of training isn't as productive as people thought it was, and you're better off doing more sets, which is called volume, at a slightly less intensity in terms of overall muscle growth than doing super high intensity and short rests. Body mechanics hasn't changed in the last 100 years. And it won't change in the next 100 years. The ideal shoulder movement is today what it was 50, 100 years ago, etc. So you might ask the question, why are some exercises not used today they were used before, right? Which is the same question as to why should you do some new exercises today that we didn't do before? Because once upon a time, exercises that they used to do, they're not doing now, like a pullover, right? A pullover is a perfect example of how we learned through trial and error that they weren't as productive as we were told. I mean, the idea that it's going to expand your rib cage is nonsense. You're not getting inside the rib cage and pushing out or pulling the ribs apart. You're moving the arm, right? The arm has nothing to do with the rib cage, right? So that has fallen by the wayside. Now, the problem is that there's a lot of people doing conventional, traditional exercises together with a lot of good exercises, right? And the overall result is good, but that's only because the bad exercises or the compromised exercises don't undo the benefit of the good ones. But at the end of the day, you don't know what worked. You get on stage, you look good, and you assume that all exercises contributed equally, but they didn't, they can't have. The question that I'm asked often is, how do I know that what you're saying is correct? How do I say that what you're saying is any better than what other people are saying? And I would say, look, I'm asking you to think. I'm asking you to use a little bit of logic here, right? So we know that more muscle load equals more muscle growth. If I can show you with levers, if I can show you with provable mechanics that you can get more load with less weight. There's no doubt, logically, that muscle will grow more because it's loaded more, even though you're using a lesser weight. So it is true that we're not going to be able to get everyone to understand that using less weight can load a muscle more. That's true. That's okay. I mean, there's going to be people out there that are going to be dogmatic and believe what they've always believed. And there are going to be people that are very emotionally attached to their squats and their rituals of, the Wednesday evening bench press session with the 6 buddies who can bench press the most, who can do the most pull-ups, right? That is part of human nature for some people. But for those people who are more thinkers, for those people that are more rational, less emotional, less inclined to follow trends, then this will make sense to them. That's all I'm asking. This is not something that has to be taken on faith. This is something that is very, very logical and sensible, and all you have to do is look at it. We live in a time right now where social media is just dominating, and everyone is being brainwashed by influencers and people with good physiques, and in fact, most of the time, these people are telling you they're doing something they don't actually do or taking supplements they don't actually take. The bottom line is that you have to think for yourself. Look, I don't care. I really don't care if this thing that I teach becomes popular or not. I'm not trying to be commercial in this. I'm not trying to capitalize on this thing. I just think it's absolutely fascinating, absolutely provable, absolutely quantifiable. For those people that are smart enough to experiment with it and try it, the people who have already tried it have said it feels better, it produces better results. We've had some guys that are in their 50s and 60s who used to compete, who've now returned to bodybuilding competition because they've discovered they can train again. They can train productively again, right? So, look, if it works for you, it works for you. If it doesn't, it doesn't. I don't care either way. It's not, for me, it's not about being popular. It's all about just delivering truth. The problem that exists in the fitness industry, well, probably in a lot of industries, but the fitness industry is no exception, and that is that it's commercialized. And the commercialization causes the marketers to create products that are not necessarily the best, but they'll try to convince you they are. And so everyone gets confused while they're buying all this stuff they don't actually need. When you boil it down to the 16 factors that determine exercise efficiency, it really limits the number of machines and the number of products and the number of exercises that you need. And so this is one of the reasons why you won't see this stuff in a magazine, is because magazine try to sell you a different issue every single month. They have to come out with something new every single month. If they just consolidated that and gave you the truth, they'd be done in 12 or 14 issues, and then they'd be out of business, right? So this is what, consumers have to deal with, the misleading misinformation that comes from marketers that makes them think that they've got to do this and they've got to do that. But in fact, it's much simpler than that. Once you know those 16 factors, it really simplifies and narrows down into the 20 top best movements. You have to keep in mind that a muscle's function is skeletal movement. How does skeletal movement happen? It happens because you have a muscle fiber that crosses a joint. It originates here, it inserts over here, and when that muscle shortens, it bends or extends, moves that joint in between. That is a muscle's job. That's its function, right? So once you understand that basic premise, you understand what would be the ideal direction of skeletal motion that muscle will produce, right? And then you can answer other questions like, well, how productive is isometric? So if I'm doing a deadlift and I'm doing it for my lower back, first of all, there is no lower back muscle. There's erector spinae. They go up alongside your spine. When that erector spinae is used to maintain rigidity in the spine, because the hip joint is doing the moving during a deadlift, then it's going to be a compromised benefit because the muscle wants to elongate and contract. So you're better off rolling and arching your spine against resistance and doing what that muscle does dynamically. These are part of the 16 factors that you need: dynamic extension and contraction of a muscle in the right direction of anatomical motion for maximum benefit. So another one of the 16 factors is range of motion. Right? Everyone needs to think about the range of motion. If you're doing an exercise, ask yourself, what is full extension and full contraction in this exercise. What surprises me is you see these people, and I don't know if they're even thinking when they're doing a set, but they're doing this little itty bitty movement, right? They know that this opens the muscle and this contracts the muscle. And then sometimes I'll tell them, no, do full range of motion, and they'll do a rep or two, and then they go right back to this again. And it's like, okay, so I'm gonna not say anything because I don't wanna be a pain in the ass here, but the fact is that full range of motion is better than partial range of motion, and partial range of motion is better than no range of motion, which means isometric is even less good than partial range of motion. What are planks? Isometric. You can't possibly expect an optimum muscular development benefit for the abdominals by doing an isometric exercise if it isn't even partial range of motion, much less full range of motion. Now, some people would argue that you're trying to protect your spine, and I would argue, well, overextending the spine is bad, overcontracting the spine is bad, but there is a safe range of motion. So knowing the limits of each joint, of the spine, of the shoulder, of the knees, of the back, knowing those things and working within the parameters that are known to be safe is part of the 16 factors too. A lot of the equipment that are in gyms is not designed properly. If it followed the biomechanics, ideally, it would be designed differently. It'd be more complex. The problem is that gym equipment companies usually don't want to build something that is necessarily ideally designed. They want something that's going to sell. So a lot of times what sells is a machine that's designed to minimize the load you put on there so that you can put a lot of weight on there and feel really strong when you're moving all this weight, when in fact, you know, if it was designed differently, you wouldn't be able to lift as much. You're still working just as hard, right? But it's designed in a way to gratify the egos. And it's designed in ways to be different, right? So for example, an ideal rowing exercise would pull in toward the spine, but some of these machines pull from in to the outside, right? Why? Because the market is wanting something different and new, right? Well, now you're moving away from the spine toward the rear deltoids, right? So this is the problem, is that, you know, people are misled by thinking that anything that's new must be good, but the fact is, it all boils down to those 16 factors. Marketers are constantly bombarding consumers with ideas that they need this and they need that, and if they don't have this, then they get. That's false, and that's the problem. Is what I'm teaching is pretty anti-commercial. What I'm teaching actually narrows it down to the simplest 20 movements, and marketers dislike that. Equipment companies won't like that, right? They want to create infinite, options, and the fact is the body doesn't need infinite options. It needs certain 20 perfectly precise movements to get the best results, and unfortunately that's not what the marketers want to see. The problem is always commercialization. The problem is always the fact that there's money involved, and ways that produce more money are oftentimes dishonest or inaccurate. So for example, trainers are not fully informed, properly guided by the very industry that is certifying them. Why? Because the industry that certifies them is trying to get them to come back year after year for their annual conventions. And the only way they'll do that is if they bring new information, trendy information, right? Well, the trends are oftentimes less productive, less beneficial than other methods and than scientifically proven methods. But they can't just give you those methods and say, have a nice day. So they have to keep bringing new things to the table. In the meantime, the trainer wants to be able to make a living, pay his rent, put food on the table. How's he gonna do that? By creating the illusion to clients that there's an infinite variety of stuff that he can show you, right? Instead of saying, look, these are the 20 things that will best benefit you. Let's do those 20 things forever, right? Well, this is counterproductive to making a living for the trainer unless that trainer understands that what that client wants isn't necessarily just information. They also want companionship and motivation and all that. So there's a role for trainers to learn these 20 movements, to learn the way the anatomy works best. that doesn't necessarily include them having an infinite variety of trend. Psychology is a very complicated thing, and there's no getting away from it. All of us are dealing to some degree with choices that were led to by different psychological influences, right? So most of us started in bodybuilding and muscle building because we love the idea of muscles. We love the idea of comic book superheroes. So there's a little bit of fantasy going on just with the concept of muscle building, right? But then you get to the gym and then you fall into this whole machismo thing, and you end up being led in your choice making by things that are not necessarily practical or scientifically sound. You end up doing what might be considered exhibition lifting, right? You're basically showing off. You're trying to meet expectation. You're trying to identify as masculine. And that gets very ambiguous. It gets very slippery to decide what makes me masculine, what makes me the best I can be. I would say what makes you the best you can be is being smart about your choices. Pursuing muscle building, but pursuing it sensibly, pursuing it logically, scientifically. Don't pursue it just with this idea that you're just gonna be an animal, that the more that you vomit, the more that you strain your spine, the more that you bend the bar, that somehow that is going to define your identity and your masculinity. I think that's foolish. I think you'd be wiser to take a sensible approach and say, yes, I can build a great physique. I can be big and I can be strong without trying to squat the most amount of weight, without trying to be the heaviest bench presser in the gym, without vomiting, without exhibiting what might be considered barbaric behavior, doing 1,000-pound leg press with all of the risks involved with that. We have to be sensible about how we define masculinity. It's important to understand what I mean by the Brig 20. What are the Brig 20 and who are they for? And what I would say is the Brig 20 are the best anatomical motions for resistance exercise. You can apply that to bodybuilding. You can apply that to powerlifting. You can apply that to training for football. You can apply it to your 10-year-old boy's PE class. In other words, a safe motion is a safe motion. A productive motion is a productive motion. It's good for everyone to know what constitutes the safest shoulder motion, the safest chest motion, the safest lat motion. It's good for everyone to know what that is. And then if you want to go to the gym and do other things, or maybe you don't have a gym, or maybe you don't have the things that the Brig 20 require, then at least you know that you can get as close to that as possible, because the shoulder joint is supposed to do this, because the hip joint is supposed to do that, the knee joint is supposed to. So yes, you can always supplement, right? And you can use different levels of intensity. You could do it as a fitness thing. You could do it as a muscle building thing. You could do it as a competitive bodybuilding thing. You could use it to supplement your powerlifting. All of this information is just basically sensible science biomechanics.
I was looking for the best bicep exercise. So I went online and typed that, and I got many suggestions from different fitness influencers and bodybuilders. But I didn't find the exact answer that I was looking for. Why is it a good exercise? So by chance, I got Doug Brignoli video on Rick's Corner, and he was explaining many things that I didn't hear before. So at the end, he said, if you want to know more, check out my book. I got his book, and I was really fascinated about it. The information that is there, I didn't hear other bodybuilders talking about, or I'm a certified personal trainer, and they didn't even mention the biomechanics the way he mentioned it, and neurology and all that. So I reached out to him and I told him, are you doing anything about this? Like, where can people find this? And I found out that he's not the guy who will be taking this to the world. So that's why I wanted to get this to like anyone who's interested in learning the proper way of resistance training and really benefit from this knowledge, because I believe it will impact them positively and get them the results that they were looking for. What I like about Doug is that he is originally a bodybuilder. He has 43 years of competitive bodybuilding, and he's also able to explain complex biomechanics in an easy language that anybody can understand. That's what made me really connect with him, and I feel that even if a person doesn't know about fitness enough, when he hears this for the first time, it will make sense to him, and he will be able to implement these principles to his daily workout routine, and he will see different results from these exercises.
You know, I'm optimistic, and I'd like to believe that people are sensible and that people will grasp logic, that they'll understand the sensibility of what I'm saying in terms of biomechanics and the 16 factors that determine exercise efficiency. And if that is the case, if people are as sensible as I hope they will be, then in the future, people will be adopting these better training methods, and they will be pushing aside the old, injurious, overly excessive energy requiring exercises, and there will be far fewer injuries in the future than there have been in the past. Unfortunately, I don't know that I can have that confidence, and people tend to be obstinate sometimes in terms of logic, and so sometimes they don't embrace it. I can't care. You know, I can't be invested in what people end up doing. I've had my heart broken too many times, disappointed too many times, but it's not my job to ensure that everybody does the right thing. What I care about is getting it out there, getting the valuable, truthful, scientific information out there, and what people do with it is up to them. Is he done? See, but that's part of the mentality. They think it's look how beastie I am, right? It must be good, but they love that.